Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of I Came for Science, a show about sex and reproduction and inclusion in STEM. I'm your host, Laura Surratt. I'm a professor of biology, and I've been studying animal sex for the past 30 years. Please join me as we normalize talking about sex and what we know about it, as well as the journeys of the scientists who study it. I am so happy today to have a former student and current colleague, Harper Jones, join us today to talk about female arousal. Harper is a doctoral student in clinical psychology at the University of Nebraska, working in the Women's Integrative Sexual Health Lab, or the WISH Lab, with Dr. Tierney Lorenz. Welcome, Harper.
Thank you. It's so much fun to be here.
So much fun. I'm so glad you reached out about this. Before we get started today, I want to note that Harper is not speaking on behalf of the University of Nebraska or representing any of their views. I also want to define two terms that Harper will be using: masc, which she uses to refer to someone who is stereotypically masculine presenting, and femme, which she uses to refer to someone who is stereotypically feminine presenting. I thought we could start by talking about the research you did when we were working together here at the College of Worcester.
Yeah, that sounds great. Honestly, I feel like the research that we did looking at male sexual function and infertility honestly really started me on this journey to studying women's sexual health. So always happy to talk about it.
Great. Could you tell the listeners what you studied for your undergraduate thesis?
Yeah, so I was looking at the effects of auditory cues. It almost sounds like a cocktail party where you have a bunch of people talking and they're overlapping voices of more masc presenting voices and more femme presenting voices, and the effect of those cues on sexual function parameters. So specifically looking at sperm count or the way that the sperm moves or motility, really based on this idea of, can we induce competition? So for instance, we see that like some different animals, when they have other males in the environment, have an increase in sperm parameters. They increase the amount of sperm that's released. They increase the motility, or the amount of sperm that's actually moving and can actually be fertilized. And so what we were looking at is like, well, can we do this with humans? Can we increase motility through a simple act of listening to audio cues where we can kind of pseudo-induce that competition with more voices that are masked? So the first thing we did was we had to make the audio cues themselves. And so I spent a lot of time listening to people who would just talk. They recorded their voices for science, and you can use their audio clips. So then I would take small clips of people who identified as female and had those kind of higher frequency or higher pitch voices. And I would cut segments of those audio cues and overlap them with audio from people who had the more mask audio. And so I created different ratios. There'd be audio clips that were just people with femme voices talking, and then there would be some that were just people with mask voices talking, and then there would be those mixtures of like a couple of women and a couple of men and more men and less women. So once we had those audio cues, we had people come into our lab at the College of Worcester, and they would come to our lab space. They would listen to these audio cues while watching sexual stimuli. When we say sexual stimuli, what we really mean is what you think of when you say porn. So erotic images or videos of people engaging in sexual activity. For the purposes of our study, they were engaging in solo masturbation. So they would be watching these videos. We would be playing these audio cues, and we would have them masturbate into a cup so that we could then analyze the semen sample. And each person that came into the lab, we had them complete the study twice. So they listened to the ratios that are going to be with more male voices to less female voices, and then less female voices to more male voices. So then we could compare the two samples.
Gotcha. And what did you find?
What we found is, one, it's a little bit hard to do sexual health research. And so we were struggling to have a ton of participants. So nothing that we can really speak to in terms of having enough data to really make any firm conclusions. However, the trends that we did see is that men who were listening to the audio clips that had more male voices had a higher sperm motility. So that was the amount of sperm that actually was moving, and the amount of sperm that could fertilize an egg.
So that was a trend, but it wasn't significant with the sample size. Yeah.
I would have loved to continue that work and
yes,
create more data or get more data, but
yes, we need another student to follow up on it. Yes. So then you graduated back in 2019, and what have you been doing since then?
I knew I wanted to work in the field of clinical psychology, and I knew that I wanted to work at this intersection between trauma and sexual functioning. I think for me, both combined with, doing some research on sexual functioning with Dr. Sherrod or Laura, as well as doing research at the University of Kentucky with Crystal. I was doing some research related to sexual functioning and PTSD there as well. And I had this kind of overlapping interest. And I think I also had this recognition that sexual trauma is something that's incredibly prevalent. And I think leaving college, that was something that was really deeply on my mind. And I wanted to center that in the clinical work that I did. I found that that was something that was important to me, and learning the skills to be able to work with people who've experienced trauma was something that was really important. So I started looking for labs that did that work. In the process of picking a lab or a place to go to school for clinical psychology is really finding the research fit that works for you. And so I found Dr. Tierney Lorenz, who is one of the few labs in the country that really studies women's sexual health. Really, yeah. Some of the methods that we do, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later, there's only a couple of labs in North America that have the tools that we do to research sexual health. And so I just found the work that they did super incredible. Interviewed, came out here, really loved the fit, and decided to move here. And so I moved here back in 2020.
Cool. And I know one of the topics that Dr. Lawrence's lab studies lots of different topics, but one of the topics they study is female arousal. And so I was wondering if you could tell us more about what's meant by arousal.
So we study arousal kind of in two different ways. When we're thinking about sexual arousal, we think about both the mental arousal or the physical arousal. And so when we're talking about mental arousal, it's this notion of like, I'm mentally aroused, I'm mentally engaged, I want to engage in sex, I feel this desire, I feel this arousal. And then we think about physical arousal of, are you experiencing, for people with vaginas, are you experiencing lubrication? Are you experiencing like tingly sensations? Are you experiencing sensations in your breasts? For people who have penises, are you experiencing an erection? So we study both this physical arousal and this mental arousal, and are often interested in the times in which those really match up well for people and the times that they don't match up well for people.
Interesting. So is it pretty normal for them not to match up in some people?
Honestly, I think it's so much more normal than we ever really talk about. I don't think we talk about this discordance or this difference between mentally aroused and physically aroused. I think we see a lot of women in our lab who talk about sexual experiences with their partner where they're like, you know what, I really want to have sex, but my body is not responding. And vice versa, people who experience, their body's responding, but they're not mentally there. They're not mentally engaged.
Interesting. So in order to study female arousal, you have the subjective and the objective measures, or the kind of mental and physical arousal. What types of techniques and tools do you use to measure these types of arousal?
I will start with the subjective measures of arousal first. Those are often going to be the most common measures of arousal. And so when we say subjective, we again mean that mental arousal. There's a couple of different ways that you can do that. In our lab, we primarily use almost like an emotion scale questionnaire. So we have them come into our lab and they answer a list of questions that range from like, how sexually aroused are you feeling, from a 1 to 10. And then we ask other questions about like, how much would you want to have sex right now, from 1 to 10. And so we ask questions about their arousal. We also ask questions using those subjective measures to get at physical arousal too. So we say, how physically aroused are you feeling? Scale of 1 to 10. How much anxiety are you feeling? Scale of 1 to 10. So we have people come into our lab and answer these questions, and then we have them watch a sexual film. So to try to get aroused, they can watch the sexual film, they can engage in masturbation, and then we ask those questions again afterwards of like, after engaging in the sexual arousal, attempting to be aroused, what is your sexual arousal 1 to 10? What's your mental arousal 1 to 10? And so that's one method to get at that subjective measures of arousal. There are also some labs that do it differently. There are some research labs that when they're measuring subjective arousals, they have what we call a key press test. And so they'll have people kind of do the same thing. They'll come into their research lab, they will engage in trying to be physically aroused by watching a sexual film. And then as our arousal increases, you press a button arrow to indicate your arousal is increasing, and then press a down arrow to indicate your arousal is decreasing. So all of these are subjective measures because they're getting at like, what do you mentally think your arousal is at, and can you tell us that?
So what about the objective or physical arousal?
For our lab, when we think about objective or physical arousal, we have a really cool instrument that we're obsessed with, and it's called the vaginal photoplethysmograph. We call it the probe. The probe is almost like a tampon-shaped device. It's a medical grade device that people with vaginas insert into their vagina, and it's connected to a EKG. So we're also getting a measure of your heart rate at the same time. And so we'll have people come to our lab, they'll be connected to the EKG, getting a measure of their heart rate, and then they'll also insert the probe into their vagina. And the way that the probe works is the probe has a little tiny box that emits a small amount of infrared light that is reflected off the walls of the vagina. And so as a person gets more aroused, there's more blood flow in the walls of the vagina, and that changes the amount of light that gets reflected back. And so that amount that gets reflected back is a measure of arousal. What we get on our end is kind of the amount of light reflecting back, indicating says there's more blood flow, there's more light reflecting back, and that's an increase in physical arousal.
Very cool. I'm curious how far into the vagina they have to insert this device.
Yeah, so when I say it's like a tampon, it almost looks like it's about the size of a typical tampon. So it's inserted about 2 inches into the vagina, and then it'll have kind of a small wire that is connected outside of it.
Cool. And how do women respond to this? Are they pretty receptive to using it? Is it uncomfortable?
It's definitely something that I think when people sign up to engage in our studies, we're really forward about. We're going to have you come into our lab. We're going to have you engage in masturbations. We're going to look at your sexual arousal specifically. And so often the people that are coming to our lab, they already know that up front. So they're more receptive to this idea. Most folks describe after using it that they don't really notice it's in pretty small, and therefore it's not necessarily something that they physically notice, but it is something that obviously you're in a sterile lab space, you're in a small white room, and that in itself is always a factor when it comes to arousal.
Lots of things. Yeah. So then you have these techniques and tools. And what are some of the types of questions that your lab looks at?
In our lab, we look at a couple of different things. So one thing that we look at is how physical and mental arousal differ between people who are pre and post menopause. And so that's something that we've been really interested in is like, are there changes?
So interesting. Yeah.
People endorse changes in their arousal after menopause. We see changes in lubrication and changes in the vagina itself. And so because of that, we're trying to look at these physio measures. They experience changes in arousal pre and post menopause. Is that concordant or is that similar to their mental arousal as well? So that's one of our research questions that we've been looking at. So when we're talking about measures or methods that my lab uses, I guess I forgot to mention that we also collect vaginal fluid samples, we collect saliva samples and blood samples, and we use those samples to look at concentrations of different markers of stress like cortisol, as well as we can use those samples to stage people about where they are in their menstrual cycle based on like the level of estrogen or progesterone. And so concurrently with these kind of other physio measures, we're collecting these biomarkers as a measure of stress. And so we often look at how does different levels of stress relate to physical arousal or mental arousal as well.
So interesting. And you've been working on your graduate studies and research there. Can you tell us specifically about your research and what you've been looking into?
I mentioned earlier that one thing that really excited me about grad school and working in this lab is looking at the intersection between sexual function and people who've experienced sexual trauma. And that's something that has been really important to me. And so through that work, one thing that I've been looking at is the role of using substances with sexual activity. So when I say substances, I mean things like alcohol or marijuana or other the recreational drugs, and how that influences people's experience of sex, kind of what are the different motivations for using these substances with sexual activity. And I think it's really derived of some frustration I had on my hand. I was like looking at the literature and I was like, okay, we see that a lot of people are reporting using alcohol before or during sexual activity. And often the literature or the research up until now has really been focused on this idea that people who have experienced sexual trauma are using these substances purely to kind of dissociate or to reduce inhibitions with sex. And I think that is true. And our research shows that there are some women who've experienced sexual trauma who are using these substances to overcome inhibitions and to engage in some emotional numbing or distancing when it comes to sexual activity. But that's not the whole story. That's not completely true. There are a lot of women who are using substances for other purposes. And so kind of built from my frustration when I went to the literature trying to find these sources and they weren't there, I've really been focusing my dissertation in my graduate studies looking at what are the other reasons people report using these substances with sexual activity and how does that work?
So interesting. So what are some of the patterns that you're finding?
One of the first papers I was looking at a couple of different motivations for using substances with sexual activity, specifically asking people, are you using these substances to increase your arousal or desire? Are you using these substances with sex to reduce inhibitions? Or are you using these substances to make it easier to have an orgasm? And I think for me, like those are fairly limited. I think there are a lot of other reasons, but that was definitely the place we started. One paper I wrote was looking at the role of sexual excitation and sexual inhibition and the way that sexual trauma is related to sexual excitation and inhibition and these motivations for using substances.
And do you find, like, just from the stories you hear or from the data you've collected, that there's different answers for different types of substances, like alcohol versus marijuana versus other types of drugs?
Definitely, yeah. I think there are differences between substances, and I also think there's differences, again, when we think about how substances impact physical arousal and mental arousal. Take alcohol, for example. Alcohol is probably the most researched. It's often easier to research substances that are legal,
Mhm.
the ways that they work in the body. And so most people report kind of a dose-dependent effect. With some alcohol, they report this increase in mental arousal and this increase in physical arousal. As you drink more alcohol, they kind of report this decrease in physical arousal, regardless of if their mental arousal increases or not. And
And this
so
is in women we're talking about.
this is
Yeah.
in women. For alcohol, this is fairly true for men as well. At lower doses, there's this increase in sexual functioning, both mentally and physically. And then at higher doses, this really drops off, both for men and women to have
Okay.
lower physical sexual functioning. I find it really interesting because you find women who are reporting drinking multiple drinks at a time, kind of passing this effect where the physical arousal is starting to decrease. However, they're still reporting this really high level of mental arousal of like drinking
Mm.
glasses is what's allowing me to have sex with my partner. It's allowing me to engage in sex in the way that I wanted to have this pleasure, even though they're noticing that their body isn't responding the same. So for me, it's curious about, what are the times that that mental arousal is outweighing the physical arousal?
Interesting. So, how do we know these impacts of alcohol and arousal? How are those studies done?
So alcohol is one that has actually been studied in a research setting. So there have been some labs who've completed research studies looking at the effects of alcohol on physical and mental arousal in women within a laboratory setting. And what that looks like is you'll have participants come into the lab, you'll administer them a standard dose of alcohol to get them to a certain blood alcohol content, and then you'll measure their physical arousal, you measure their mental arousal, and then you'll administer a higher dose and say, okay, well, what does the mental and physical arousal look like when you are more drunk or have a higher blood alcohol content? And so when we think about alcohol, we actually do have these lab-based studies that are suggesting that dose-dependent curve. At lower levels, we see increase in arousal, increase in both physical and mental arousal. And then at higher levels of intoxication, we see that lower level of arousal.
So interesting. I had no idea those studies were going on. And what about other substances?
Other substances are for sure less studied when we're thinking about those standardized lab-based studies. However, there's been some more research looking at self-report, so how people say these substances are working in their body. When we're thinking about cannabis specifically, cannabis is generally thought of as a substance that is going to increase sexual function, increase your arousal, increase your desire to engage in sex. But the research is suggesting there's more mixed findings there, and it really seems to be person dependent. So for some people, they are experiencing this increase in sexual pleasure and arousal, both physically and mentally, whereas other people are endorsing that they're having diminished sexual arousal, both physically and mentally. And I was actually looking at a study recently that was showing that the majority of people who report using cannabis or weed with sex actually report having both positive and negative experiences.
Interesting. I mean, there's probably so much individual variation in so many things, like how much they're using, their individual body and how it reacts, but also the cannabis itself and its potency or its chemical makeup as well. So interesting. Any other substances that you've looked into?
Yeah, there's a little bit of research on ecstasy or MDMA, and it's probably most commonly thought of as like the party drug that has you having this heightened euphoria and this heightened pleasure. And that's really driven, or at least the research suggests that's really driven by this increase in desire for connection and for emotional closeness, which may be associated with people being more receptive for sexual activity because they're having this desire for connection and emotional closeness and pleasure. The physio or the physical arousal research on ecstasy actually reports the complete opposite, that ecstasy or MDMA is actually like reducing or impairing physical arousal. And
Oh,
some people,
wow.
yeah,
Yeah.
which I found like super interesting in terms of there's this desire to engage in sex and to have that emotional closeness, but physically, this is actually inhibiting your sexual function.
So interesting. I'm wondering as I listen to you, what role stigma plays in all of this? Like there's stigma around sex, there's stigma around female arousal and female interest in sex, there's stigma around sexual trauma, and there's stigma around substance use. So I'm just wondering how all of those intersect and affect women's use and kind of ownership of their use of substances around their sexual activity.
Honestly, that's such a good point. It is so nuanced. There are people who receive messages, like women receive messages that you should be a sexual being, that you should have this responsive desire. So for some women have this expectation or this pressure by society that they're supposed to be sexual beings. They're supposed to engage in sexual activity and be aroused and have sex with their partners. And men often report having spontaneous desire, that they just naturally have desire. It's really easy to get turned on. Whereas that is not always true for women. A lot of women report what we call responsive desire, or desire that comes after, foreplay and emotional connection and intimacy. And that discord between the expectation to just naturally be aroused and that pressure to engage in sex and the desire to engage in sex with a partner, I think is often one of the reasons that people report using these substances. Of, if I use these substances, then I have that more mental arousal. It's easier for me to get aroused, and then I can meet my partner's expectation. I can meet these expectations based on society.
Okay, so some of that comes from societal pressures, but does some just come from an intrinsic desire of how it makes them feel as well?
Yeah, and that's where I think the literature has like truly failed us, and the research has
Okay.
truly failed. Is very few labs, very few doctors and researchers really care about women's sexual pleasure, and I think that's something that my lab and Dr. Lorenz and the work that we do is really trying to center. Is that there are women who use substances with sexual activity. There are women who have sex for the hell of it, to enjoy having sex, and substances because it makes sex better, it makes them feel better. And I think that is something that isn't talked about. I feel like you're right. There is some stigma around being able to enjoy sex. There's this like double-edged sword of, you're supposed to be a sexual being because you're supposed to have sex with your partner, but if you enjoy sex too much, then maybe you're promiscuous, and
Mhm.
that is receiving those negative connotations. So it's just so nuanced.
Yeah, we haven't really delved into how the history of trauma fits into all this. Like, what's different about people with a history of trauma and people without that history in terms of this intersection of sex and substance use?
So for one of the studies that I was doing when I was talking about sexual excitation and sexual inhibition, so sexual excitation is this kind of desire for increased pleasure and increased arousal, and sexual inhibition is kind of the opposite of that. So we can think about it of almost like one is the gas, like sexual excitation is the gas, is increasing arousal, and then sexual inhibition is the brakes, and it's reducing it. There's this theory of sexual arousal that kind of suggests that sexual excitation has to be high enough to overcome sexual inhibition for arousal to occur. And so one research study that I was looking at people who have trait level excitation versus trait level inhibition, and how that is related to sexual trauma. Trait level is kind of a pre-existing stable level of excitation or stable level of inhibition. Trait level is also thought of as like the opposite of state. State is going to change, more variable over time, whereas trait is supposed to be stable over time. So when we're thinking about women who have experienced trauma, who have higher levels of trait level sexual excitation, so they're more easily aroused or more interested and engaged in sex and pleasure. Women who have sexual trauma report using substances more with sexual activity. And so when we're looking at why that is, one thing is the sexual excitation or the sexual inhibition. And what we found is women who had a sexual trauma history with higher levels of sexual excitation, that almost explained the whole relationship between sexual trauma and substance use with sex. And so what that suggested to us is that these women are using these substances not necessarily for inhibition, but more for pleasure. They're using these substances following sexual trauma to get more
Oh,
pleasure.
that really turns the story around, doesn't it?
Well, and that was like not what we expected when we started this.
Yeah.
We started it, we're like, well, most of the literature, most of the way that we think about sexual trauma is related to these inhibitions. And what we found was really the opposite, that these women are using these substances with higher levels of sexual excitation. They're reporting these motivations for pleasure, and that's really driving their substance use with sexual activity, which caused me to take like a whole step back and be like, okay, we have to change the way that we think about using substances with sexual activity. And maybe there are moments in which using these substances are a positive thing for women.
So, what would you say are the implications or even the next steps for this research?
For me, one thing that I'm really interested in is taking the motivations or the reasons women are using substances with sexual activity, both women who've experienced a sexual trauma history, but also women who might be experiencing sexual dysfunction, and taking a more broad approach of like, we used to, in the research, really just give you like a couple of options for pleasure, for inhibitions. And I think there's so many more options in that. There's specifically to achieve orgasm, specifically to be closer with their partner, to enjoy sex more, to reduce sexual pain. For me, my next step of research is really to look at, okay, if we give you so many different options for why you're using substances with sexual activity, what's the story? What are we learning there? And how does that relate to your sexual functioning? Are these substances really meeting the goal for you? Because I think that's the impression of if women are using alcohol or using cannabis with sex, are you actually meeting your goal? Are you using these substances because you want to have better sex? And are you actually having that better sex? So when we think about the implications, it's for me lying in, are we meeting your goal? Or is there still something else going on?
I love that. And it seems to really fit with your career goal of being a clinical psychologist and like having conversations about this rather than limiting people's options to what they might know about or be knowledgeable about. Like, okay, I could either drink or smoke pot or eat edibles or whatever, or not do anything. Like, those are my options. But really, what you're saying is there's a lot of other options. And if you just could be clear on what your goals are, that someone like you, a clinical psychologist or someone else in the field, could really help them to choose what's right for them and meets their goals. I love that.
Yeah, and I think it's also important when you're thinking about sexual functioning, if we have people who are using these substances because they're experiencing a lot of sexual pain and that's numbing their sexual pain, are we really masking the problem? Are there other things contributing to their sexual pain? Can we talk about medications? Can we talk about seeing a gynecologist? And so really getting at like, what is the root of, whatever problem you're addressing? And if it's not a problem that you're addressing, how can you use these substances safely? How can we talk about people using substances with sex in a way that is safe for them and for their partner and to meet those goals?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think sometimes the solutions might be simpler than people even think. Like sometimes it's just a situational change that could probably change how they're feeling about sex and their arousal. Have you found anything like that?
Yeah, I think anecdotally for sure, when we're talking about this idea of responsive desire for women, it really does come down to, okay, for some women, scheduling a time to have sex with their partner is really freeing for them. They know that they have this expectation, they can plan for it, they can plan for the mental arousal, they can really be engaged in it because it isn't coming out of the blue for them. Whereas for other women, changing the things about the setting or the environment or the type of lubrications that they're using, right? There are small changes that can really impact the environment and the way that people can engage in sex. And I think you're right, there are these subtle shifts that we don't necessarily talk about. I think we're prone to not talking about sex. And if we start opening these
Right.
conversations and thinking about the way that we engage in sex with people and the way that we view ourselves as sexual beings too, when we're thinking about women, I think it's so important to think about how you view yourself as a sexual being, how you engage with your body as well. Do you know your body? Do you know what feels good to you or not as well?
It's so important. Yeah. And I'm so glad we're doing this interview because not only do we not talk about sex enough, but also within sex, we don't talk about arousal enough. And within arousal, we don't talk about female arousal enough and like satisfaction and what that means for you. And that's going to be different for some people. It's going to be penetration. For some people, it's going to be orgasm. For some people, it's going to be totally different, and all of that's okay. But really just being able to talk about it and explore it and think about it is so important. And, whether you're talking to your partner or a therapist or a counselor, like just being able to talk about it so that you're getting what you want.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think that's something that I hope like with the research that I do and the clinical work that I do as well, that we're starting to open these conversations where it doesn't have to be like, do you fit in this box or not? Instead, it's like, okay, what are your options? What
Mm-hmm.
are your goals and how can we get you to those goals?
Yeah, that's so good. So, are there other questions that I haven't asked or other things you'd like to share with our listeners?
I think one thing when we're thinking about substances with sexual activity that I've been really interested in is the way that this interfaces with your health providers. When people are going to the doctor for sexual dysfunction or because they're experiencing difficulties with sex or difficulties with intimacy, anecdotally, a lot of women that I know and also a lot of the research is suggesting that people get these messages of like, oh, just have a glass of wine. That'll help you relax. That'll fix your sexual arousal difficulties or your sexual dysfunction or your pain with sex, and just how invalidating that message is. And so one thing that I really am interested in doing is kind of researching, why do providers make this suggestion? Why are we suggesting to use alcohol? Is it because it is actually helping? Is it because they don't know another answer? And so that's the other piece of it for me, is thinking about how this really is related to people's experiences at the doctor.
Yeah. And that answer doesn't wouldn't fit everyone, right? Because I don't drink wine, right? That wouldn't work for me. And yeah, is it really oversimplifying or dismissive of these concerns that women have?
Yeah, because
So
when we're
important.
talking about like, are these substances meeting your goal? Oftentimes, if there is an underlying medical reason that you're having difficulty with sex or difficulty with penetration or experiencing pain, drinking a glass of wine or using substances may or may not actually help that. And so, if you're getting those messages at the doctor, just how invalidating that is. And so, for me, I'm doing a study looking at like, okay, well, why are these providers making those suggestions so that hopefully we can kind of work to finding this goal, like you talked about earlier, of just really meeting the patient's goal with sexual activity and kind of being more inclusive on how we think about that.
So important. And just normalizing talking about it as a regular part of your health. I know you had mentioned that you might be looking for participants. So, in case our listeners are interested, how should they find out about your studies?
Yes. So if you are interested in participating in any of our studies or just learning more about the work that we do, you can go to WishLab, WISH lab at unl.edu. It'll have all of our research. It'll also have my contact information if you're interested in participating in any studies with me as well.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so glad to have you on the show, and I'm so glad you reached out. It's a pleasure to have you as a colleague who's interested in talking about the science of sex. And I'm sure our listeners will have lots of interest in the show.
Thank you. Like I mentioned, doing this work with you is really what brought me into this field. And so for me, it was just so exciting to be able to talk about the work that we do with you today.
Yeah, I'm so excited to see where it goes. Thanks again.
Thank you.
And thank you all for listening. Thanks also to our production team, Isabel Espinoza, Lane Patton, and Daphne Trilliana. The music used in this episode is from I Don't Smoke by the Mythical Score Society.